Strikes paralysing Europe's second biggest economy. Workers angry with government moves to make it easier for companies to hire and fire. Employees at oil refineries and all but 3 nuclear power stations now joining in. Are their calls loud enough for politicians to take note? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. Good to have you with us. France is slowly grinding to a halt. Strikes are affecting domestic flights and train services. Riot police have been deployed to take down barricades blocking oil refineries, roads and bridges, and a third of France's petrol stations are running dry. Workers are angry at Labour reforms designed to reduce unemployment, which have been pushed through without a parliamentary vote. Reforms they say favour bosses over workers. Natasha Butler has more from Paris.
Across France there are protests just like this one here on the Place de la Bastille in central Paris. And we've been seeing these sort of protests for well over 2 months now. But what's significant about today is we're seeing workers from nuclear power stations, oil refineries, transport and the ports all joining in. So the numbers are going to be much larger than expected. Now what everybody wants here is for the government to retract its controversial labour law. They say it favours bosses rather than employees. And that really goes to the heart of French society and French working life, where employees have always been fiercely protected. Now, the government have long said that they're not going to back down, they're not going to give in to the pressure on the streets. They say they won't scrap the law. But the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, has now said that he could consider some amendments to the law. Now, that's interesting because it shows that the government knows there is a crisis which needs to be stopped, to stop it further escalating and stop damaging the image of not only the socialist government, but also France itself.
Well, here's more of what the Prime Minister had to say.
In a few days, the Labour bill will be discussed in the Senate, where the right wing has the majority. It will give its input, which of course will not only be the total opposite of what we proposed, but it might include some of the things the people who are protesting want. It is out of the question to change direction, but there can always be some modifications, some improvements.
The protesters are organised by one of France's most powerful unions, the CGT. They want the government to scrap a new labour reform law that was pushed through without parliamentary approval 2 weeks ago. Now, that law makes it easier for companies to lay off workers in times of crisis. It also lets employers negotiate benefits like paid vacation, maternity leave and weekly hours, which were previously controlled by the government. And it gives firms more freedoms to reduce pay. Union workers are scared the law will lower their quality of living. They've organised 8 national days of protest against it since February. And a recent poll shows that 75% of French people also oppose the law. Let's hear now from Hervé Arsan from the CGT Union. He's Secretary General for the northern Paris suburb, Seine-Saint-Denis.
This law is deadly. It is based on the idea that there is a causal link between unemployment and employment regulation. This is unbearable. There's quite no link. What we need is full order books. This law is against working people. There's not a single study that shows a causal link between labor law and unemployment. It's as if you said there are diseases because there are vaccines. No, there are vaccines because there are diseases. We shouldn't put things in the wrong way around. There is a law inspired by the philosophy of the free market. The economists who support this law are also of that persuasion. They want more flexibility to increase shareholders' dividends. They don't care about working people. This law is free market from A to Z, and that we cannot accept. It is true that other countries have lower unemployment rates like Germany and the Netherlands, but you have to look at that in detail. It is easy to bring down your headline unemployment rate by putting people in part-time work, for example, or on very low salaries. We want proper jobs. In our country, 57% of our gross national product comes from consumer spending. Therefore, we should raise salaries. We are against supply-side economics, in favor of demand-side economics. We have to put petrol in the tank of the economy. That means salaries. It is schizophrenic of the free market capitalist system that they want people to spend money but don't want to give them the means to do so. We are confronted with positions that are totally ideological and dogmatic, and we are battling against that by fighting the El Khomri law. What we are asking for is the withdrawal of this bill. It is important to underline that this bill has never really been discussed. We found out what it contained in February when we read about it in the press. That already is not the right way to do things. So we want this law withdrawn so we can discuss the contents of a labor law for the 21st century.
Let's bring in our guests now. Here in the studio we have Remi Piet. He's a public policy expert and professor at Qatar University. In Paris, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, a French journalist and political columnist for the Sunday Telegraph. And joining us via Skype from Strasbourg, Francois Reyes, a One Young World ambassador. Great to have you all with us. Francois, if I could start with you and get your reaction to the union's outrage that we heard there.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. The thing with this outrage is that it goes exactly against how the unions say the France should work. What they're saying is they want to have a dialogue, but when they're confronted to the government, they say, we're not going to speak until you withdraw the law from the floor. And then when the government tries to grab a hand on the union's leaders, these leaders say they want to hang the bosses of the corporations. So you see, if they don't want to engage in a form of dialogue, how can there be any progression on that bill? I'm very surprised by the recent polls, because you're saying 75% of the French people are actually against that law, which is also very surprising when you look at the polls of the people supporting the recent riots and the recent blockade in front of the oil reservoirs. So this is, I believe, the first time French people in the majority have been supporting a protest that has gone for so long, that has a direct impact on the French citizens' lives, on the fuel restraints, on perhaps a few power cuts. I do feel like this is a once-of-a-lifetime protest.
Remi, why do you think we're seeing so much of the French public support these protests?
Well, there's different ways of looking at this. First of all, it's a protest about, reforming the labor's right. And when you're actually asking employees whether or not they would actually be in favor of reforming their rights, everybody tends to be more in favor of protectionism and be against any kind of reforms on this. Second of all, it's a law that is put forward by Francois Hollande, who's actually at the end of his administration, and there's a large proportion of French people that whatever Hollande would actually propose, they've been against it. So that law is actually not supported by the left wing of politics because it's reforming labor laws. It's also not supported, let's say, by people that tend to vote on the right because they will never support a law from Francois Hollande, himself being from the left. However, what's interesting is really to put it into context, both political and economic. People are, in some sense, fed up by the economic crisis, although we're starting to see some evolution there for the first time in 5 years. There's 2 months in a row, there's actually a decrease in unemployment figures. That could be explained and nuanced by different phenomena. And also in terms of politics, both the elections coming in, the presidential elections coming in next year, but more importantly here when we're looking at this, the trade unions elections at the end of this year, the CGT is trying to show that they're extremely strong in protecting the workers because they actually fear that they might not be the #1 trade union after this year. So here it's a question of showing how strong you are, never back down, so that you can actually show that you've worked the best you could, or even if it's not in the best interest of who you're actually trying to protect.
There's a lot of different agendas at play there.
A series of agendas, yes.
If we look at this issue of unemployment, it was voiced quite vociferously and the union sought there. Anne-Elisabeth, how do you think making it easier to hire and fire workers would reduce unemployment, as the government is suggesting?
Well, it's not just the government. There's just been a report from the IMF on the state of France and especially unemployment. And they say that the structural unemployment in France is such that even if the economy perks up again, labor laws in France, especially in other structural deficiencies, especially in training, make it so that 9 out of 10 unemployed people in France will not find jobs again. So the government is not pulling this out of their hat. The labor laws in France create an uncertainty which make it extremely difficult for bosses to commit to the long-term work relationship that it is to hire somebody with a work contract that is, as is known in France, indefinite, i.e. not a short work contract which we cannot renew more than once. The French labour market is such that I've never known it not in crisis. In the 25 years I've worked, I've never known it in any other situation than bosses hiring only at the last minute and very reluctantly. And because they do not know actually how it's going to be when they try to fire someone. It's possible that it will not be too difficult if they had just cause. It's entirely possible that the Inspection du Travail, the government labour inspectors will say, no, you can't do this like that, and then it will be protracted and costly. It is entirely possible that the salaried person who is being fired will go, as a matter of course, to employment tribunals, and those courts usually favour the salaried. And in general, the whole thing makes it very difficult to manage teams. So you've got people who stay too long on jobs, and when I say stay too long on jobs, I mean they don't like the jobs they're doing anymore. Sometimes they're being sidelined rather than fired. The morale in the company is bad. The people themselves don't like staying in jobs that they don't like anymore, but they are certain that they will not find a comparable job, and therefore they hang on to dear life. And this makes for an incredibly negative work environment. And again, it makes it also the fact that the CGT, the union, the Communist Union, which quite rightly so my predecessor just said, is essentially fighting for its own interest here in staying or becoming again the most important and dynamic union in France. But CGT is defending in effect people who already have jobs. They are defending people who are protected by the current laws, and they are preventing all comers, outsiders, young people, people from minorities to actually get jobs. So it's a bad situation, and the law is actually rather timid, but it was trying to bring some flexibility into a system while keeping for the French what they have, which in other countries does not exist so well. For instance, it doesn't exist in the UK. Good unemployment compensation and portable, of course, national health. So I can see why people would be scared, but they have been scared for many years, and France is slowly going down against her competitors, not even in the wild world, but even in Western Europe.
Francois, perhaps you can give us a bit of perspective from the younger generation there, because I know that some of your friends actually do support the unions. How difficult is it to get a job today in France?
Well, let's take an example. I'm 20, I have a job, I've been employed for 2 years now. Having a job in France when you're young is mainly not something you do. Why? Because you cannot sign a contract and have a good job with like my predecessor said, with a nice work environment. So you usually find a summer job or a vacation job in February or in April, but you don't look for a long-term job because you don't believe that the employer is going to give you a job if you don't have any credible diploma. But the workforce is being stuck because the government for 20 years has been putting something that for the youth, and of course not for the seniors, but for the youth is very, very damaging. And this is the internship system in France. Most of the internships that have been created for, let's say, a range from 18 years old to 25 years old are occupied by 30 and 35 years old, which means that they are overqualified, but they're paid less. So that's beneficial for the corporation that gets also tax cuts from these interns. So the whole system is rigged with tax cuts, with ambition that is being struck once you enter high school. The whole education system is linked to, after that, the labor system in France. And if you don't have a good education system, how can you expect to have a strong workforce behind that is willing to engage in a proper and good work relation with the employer? When you get into the high school, most of the teachers are telling you, well, I'm going to go on strike on that day, I'm going to protest on that day. And most of them feel like they're in their rights, which they are. But for the students which listen to this, they're mainly... they make up their minds around the fact that having a strike in France is normal. It happens on a Thursday, and then after that you can just relax and protest again. You do not have a construction of dialogue like you cannot find in Germany or in Denmark, for example. The first thing you're going to think about when there is a problem is I'm going to go on a strike and I'm going to protest. It's not going to be I'm going to go to my boss and try to figure this out.
I mean, that's true, isn't it, Remi? From the outside world, going on strike to the outsider in France is incredibly common.
Well, you have to understand also the way that labor negotiations is framed in France, which is totally different than in the UK or in Germany, for example. And that's one key element here. It's moving away from, let's say, a legal system to something that would be more contractual. Basically, that law introduces the fact that now the negotiation in terms of the terms of contracts will be negotiated company per company on certain elements, rather than by large confederation of sectors or by the law itself. And if I want to play the devil's advocate here, I actually understand some of the arguments that the labor unions are saying, that maybe in that situation the workers might be in a situation of disfavor, talking with their boss without the protection of the law. But this protection of the law have been so strict that, especially in the context when you have risk-averse bosses that do not want to employ people without having any perspective of being able to calculate how much they would lose if the employee is not doing their job, or if they have an economic situation that actually demands a reduction of the workforce, then it actually has frozen any kind of expansion of the workforce, apart from second-level jobs, like we were actually well detailed, of summer jobs, internship. And you have really here this distinction of two levels of jobs. The second element that maybe we should bring in to be the devil's advocate here is the fact that there's really a separation in France and a conflict between the workers and the boss's caste, if I can say. There's this feeling from workers that they have to take all the blame and all the sacrifice for the economic situation, but at the same time, when we're talking about potentially reducing the salaries, the highest salaries of the CEOs of large companies, there was a case of the CEO of Renault, for example, that was having maybe the equivalent of 2,000 minimum wage, so very large scope in terms of inequalities in salaries. There's no real effort maybe made by the bosses, and this feeling that past laws also passed over the last 2 or 3 years that were demanding that in return more flexibility in a work environment, that in return companies would hire. They haven't hired so much. So here we really have the question of who should take the sacrifice, whether it's the employees or the bosses. Even if clearly there's demands and needs for the French population to enter new jobs and for the companies themselves to flourish with new workers, to have certain reforms, those reforms are hard to pass because there's so much mistrust between the different people that should be around the table.
And look at the reforms that are trying to be passed now and the uproar that it's causing. I mean, even if you do agree, Anne-Elisabeth, with the need for these reforms to be pushed through, the government hasn't helped itself, has it, with the way it's gone about it, pushing it through without parliamentary approval?
The government is lurching from one crisis to the next with increasing incompetence. And frankly, I mean, you don't need to be partisan to say that. And indeed, Monsieur Hollande's ratings are the lowest of any French president in the history of the Republic. Or since they have been taking polls, he's now got 87% unfavourable opinions. I don't know how much lower he can get without getting into negative figures. And this is another instance in which the Prime Minister, for reasons of his own, including the fact that he might like to run instead of the president for the left in the next presidential election next year, has decided that he was going to be the image of firmness. He's not going to cave in because Monsieur Hollande's government has caved in so often. The result is that probably the government will cave in again on many things. There are already signs. But the problem is, it's a more general problem. I think such a law might have been passed at the beginning of the president's mandate, when the president, with half the nation elated, having voted for him, saying, look, we've got to do this, and I'm there, I am on the left, I could do like the German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who introduced similar laws in Germany 10 years ago, and I will not let you down. But Of course, there was no sign of political courage from Monsieur Hollande, and this is part of the result. But another point that was taken up by one of the guests is very important. The French labour environment is very hostile, and the French labour environment, quite honestly, is not very modern in that it is completely hierarchical. The boss is everything, the boss is always right, the boss has got 3 underbosses who vie for his job, and the rest of the salaried feel basically that they are treated like privates in World War I, minus guns. Quite honestly, it is very unpleasant to work for a French outfit most of the time. It is not conducive to trust. It is not conducive to creative solutions in terms of labour relations. And that, even more than boss compensation, is, I think, something that will push people to say, I have no trust in these people. They're not interested in what I think. They are always right. I'm always wrong. Stuff it, I will go and demonstrate, and I'm against the law. And that is part of an evolution which has existed in France for decades.
Yeah, Remi, why it brings back the other point that we made earlier, why this situation exists. If the labour environment is so hostile to workers, why are so many people against reforming it?
Because they fear that actually if you move away from the protection of the law and you actually go from company per company, the situation in terms of the balance of power and negotiation will actually be decreased. I totally agree with what has been said, apart from maybe like a few details. I don't think Hollande will cave. I mean, he has caved on a certain amount and maybe every single policy until now, I mean, because some of the idea was actually bad, such as the citizenship law, for example. He has to cave because it was the good thing to cave. But here in the case of labor law, it's really the limited hopes that you still have of being a key possibility for the presidential election, that the last chance that he has. If he caves on this, then actually he will not be able to run or have any chance of potentially winning if we think that he could be winning the next elections. Also, what he's trying to do here, because we've seen this for the last 30 years, whatever government was passing, there's been a series of attempts at reforming, and then government would actually cave, whether it was Sarkozy, whether it was Juppé, even back in 1995. And here we're talking about the 2 different political candidates that will potentially face Francois Hollande or Marine Le Pen during the next elections. Those 2 actually were not able to really reform the labor laws. And what Hollande or Valls are trying to do, whether they're successful or not, is another question. But what they're trying to do is to say, well, we were able to reform the labor market, what the others were not able to do. We're actually having some positive signs on the economy. We're having now a growth at 1.5%. I mean, it's not miraculous, but it's actually much better than what we've seen over the last few years. We have unemployment decreasing, and therefore, you see, I mean, it took some time, but if you trust me in the long run, then that will succeed. That's what they're trying to do. If they cave this way, they have absolutely no hopes whatsoever in the next elections.
Francois, what's your view on that? Do you think the government will give in?
Well, I could not agree more with Elizabeth. Would it cave in? Yes, of course it will cave in, because the situation is going to get worse. Nuclear plants are being stuck, which poses a serious national security threat. And at some point, the Prime Minister will have to cave in and will have to speak about this Article 2 that makes so much fuss about. But the truth is that in France, we lack 2 things. We lack dialogue skills. We don't have any dialogue skills. And we want to reproduce what we've seen in our education system in our workforce. Just like Elizabeth said, you have the boss, and then you have the underboss, and then the rest is just, basic workers. And they feel like nobody's going to listen to them, and the boss don't want to listen to them. It's exactly the same in a classroom in France. In high school, you have the teacher who is everything, who is the person that speaks, and you have the others who do not have the right to speak or say anything. So we produce that in our workforce. We don't give the salaries, even the most basic one, some kind of power over their decisions. So this law allows actually to have a dialogue in the corporation and to have some form of understanding of each other through these new measures that it's going to implement. And I believe that the government will cave in, because this reform is, this is my personal point of view, but too good. The French people are not ready for it yet, because the French people have never, ever, approached in a good way reforms of any form. So that's the main problem in France. We don't accept reform. And when a government tries to push it, we call it, denial of democracy, while we're still using an article that is in the Constitution.
OK, very interesting indeed, especially interesting as the world will be watching France in a couple of weeks' time with the Euro 2016 championships there. Today we do have to finish our discussion. Anne-Elisabeth, Francois and Remi here in the studio. Thank you all very much for joining us. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle and the whole team here, bye for now.